actually on how to deal with
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to one of a number of afternoon sessions covering, I think, what we see actively going on in the exhibition halls out there. How do we actually make all of the razzmatazz a reality here, not just in Scotland, but right across the UK more widely in terms of investing in the energy business? This afternoon, I think we're actually asking the best question of the whole of the conference, if indeed the whole of the exhibition, which is really, how the heck do we unlock the investment we need to do what we want to do? And in doing so, how on earth are we going to make sure that that has a meaningful impact to the economy, the people, the companies right across the UK, so we can continue to be a major energy nation for years to come? Now, the good news is, I don't have the answer to that, but I've got some friends that do, and they're on my right. My name is Mike Tolan, and I lead within Offshore Energies UK our work on sustainability. And this is very much around how do we create sustainable businesses and indeed a continually sustainable energy system for years to come. An exciting challenge, and one that I think we're gradually inching towards, and what we see happening right around the UK and indeed right around Europe at the minute. So as I say, I'm joined by four excellent panellists. Ben Sykes, who is Vice President Offshore for Environment, Consenting, External Affairs at Ørsted. Joanne Allday, who's Senior Executive for the Port of Cromarty Firth. Andrew Elms, who's Head of Business Development at Siemens Energy. And Melissa Reid, who's Head of Business Development, Commercial Asset Management at Offshore Wind at Equinor. So as you see with these organisations and these companies, they touch right the four corners of what we're involved in the energy sector, both here in the UK and indeed further afield. So the good news is they've got some of the answers and indeed some of your questions, I hope. So please use Slido, and if need be, we'll even take them live from the audience. Do not be shy. This is your opportunity to ask some searching questions on how we're going to make the journey and make it more effectively for people, for companies here in the UK, and how we're going to attract the investment that's going to really change the futures, not just of Scotland, but right across the UK as an energy powerhouse. So I'd like to, we're going to have each of our panellists here give their initial insights, and then we'll open the conversation up to discussion. And I'd also say that we're facilitated this afternoon by sponsorship from Shepherd Wedderburn. You've seen their stand outside. They're a major player here in the energy sector and indeed a very active law firm here in Scotland. So I think we'll kick off really, I think with our colleagues say here maybe their takes on things, and well, I can't remember who's coming up first, and so the raffle will be to find out. We're going to find that out in a minute. Hang on. And indeed, Ørsted won the lottery, so Ben, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming along to this session on offshore wind. I really want to make this as interactive as possible. I feel slightly daunted by Mike's suggestion that I'm going to bring any insights, but I'm going to bring a bit of narrative at least to a developer's perspective on the question of how do we drive this transition, how do we capture the supply chain benefits and the skills transfer and skills growth that we need both to keep people on board with the energy transition, but also to keep them gainfully employed. We each get to put one slide up. I'm afraid I've been greedy and taken two. This is just to give you a sense of where we are today. I wanted to start by a little bit of a trip down memory lane. Some of you will know I've been in the offshore wind industry for 15 years, so I have seen an extraordinary journey, and we talk a lot in 2024 about the supply chain, about the need to create a stronger supply chain, to invest more in the supply chain, to get more UK content in our projects. I'll come back to that because I think it's a false target to be chasing. And I think we sometimes forget, and Tim touched on this this morning, so did Jonathan Cole, we sometimes forget what we've already achieved in offshore wind, remembering that this industry really only got going in about 2005, 2006. Our first project, Barrow Offshore Wind Farm, built in 2007, at the time a groundbreaking 90 megawatts, and now a rather small 90 megawatts, but nonetheless a groundbreaking project. Since then, we have seen a huge amount of deployment, but we've also seen growth in the supply chain, and I don't want this conversation to start from the assumption that we haven't had success. We've got a lot more to do, and I'll come back to that. We've got blade factories, and I'm sure Andrew will be showing us and talking about that a little bit in terms of the journey to here and beyond. We've got cable factories. We've got another one, groundbreaking's just happening on the Sumitomo facility up at Nig. We've got a monopile factory being put together in the northeast of England. So we have actually got some big manufacturing. We also have a very deep supply chain beyond the tier one and the manufacturing of those large components. And this map really just shows one developer's supply chain. I can't see the number, so I'm having to look around. 230 suppliers. If you go to the next slide, Mike, you'll see that 55 of those from right across the UK, Ørsted is using in its global portfolio. And I think the point I would want to make about this is there are many things that the UK is good at, and actually there are many things the UK is better at than other markets. And I will come back to this because I think this question of what makes us globally competitive is absolutely fundamental to the question of how do we unlock the supply chain opportunities. So we had big growth, we had FID enabling, we've got a load of projects being built, we had the sector deal back in 2019, we set up the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership. It was only £100 million over 5 years, so rather small from supply chain perspective, but nonetheless, I think effective given its scale. But a lot has happened since then. In particular, we've had lease round 4, which put 7.5 gig out into English and Welsh waters. We've had ScotWind. I can't even remember how many tens of gigawatts, but it starts with a 3, I think. Huge amount of capacity. And crucially, we've had INTOG, and INTOG is really important because innovation and the learning through these small innovation projects is going to be so critical to getting the learnings embedded in Britain's supply chain, particularly Scotland's supply chain, and I might just touch on our Salamander project in that context. So we have seen a lot of progress. We've seen the market grow enormously, and I think what I'd like to turn to now is the industrial growth plan that was launched last month. This is a really major initiative that the industry and government and the Crown Estate and the Crown Estate Scotland and others are on board with. It's really looking meaningfully, and I would urge you to go and read it if you haven't. If you're interested in where the supply chain opportunities are, and frankly where the support is going to come, the industrial growth plan that you can download online is a really good place to start. But it focuses on 5 areas: advanced turbine technology, industrialising the manufacture of foundations and substructures, and particularly around floating wind, future electrical systems and cables, and we had Laura speaking this morning around that. Smart environmental services. Britain is actually leading in this globally, and that is a hugely exportable capability. And next generation O&M, because again, we're first movers in this sector, so we have an opportunity to build skills, technologies and capabilities that we can then export around the world. The funding of that is still being worked out, but it's definitely going to be, let's say, roughly an order of magnitude bigger than the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership. So it starts to get meaningful, and it ties in with FLOMIS, which I'm sure Joanne will talk about. It ties in with GIGA, the government's ambitious green innovation fund, green investment fund. So there's a lot to fight for here, but I do think the industrial growth plan, when we finally get it out of the starting blocks, is going to deliver something that's going to really be transformational. And I know many of you may come from an oil and gas background. I'm, amongst other things, on the board of the Global Underwater Hub. And what we see is that there are some really successful companies. Just recently, we saw one of them, Balmoral, winning a good project for a fantastic offshore wind developer called Ørsted. That has been really, I think, important for us because we need to show how these real deep expertise, that expertise that sits in the oil and gas supply chain, particularly in the northeast of Scotland, but also across the UK, how we pull that in to the offshore wind supply chain so that we can harness that and, frankly, capture a global market share of the, let's say, 250 gigawatts of floating wind, never mind the 1,750 of fixed bottom wind that's going to get built over the next 30 years. I want to touch very quickly, if I may, Mike, probably over time, on skills, because all of this is really going to deliver not only factories, businesses, but ultimately jobs. And I don't want to talk about the just transition. It's a horrible phrase, but it's an important concept. I think the industrial growth plan, which will deliver tens of thousands of jobs, we probably need about 100,000 people in this sector by 2030. We're a long way short. The skills development, the skills passporting will really enable the supply chain to bring the skills in that we're going to need to build out to the number of gigawatts, whatever it is that we achieve by 2030, maybe 50, maybe slightly less, but certainly getting to over 100 gigawatts in good time beyond that. I'll stop there, let others speak, but look forward to some challenging questions on IGP and else.
Thanks, and please don't be shy with Slido or send them to me in a £10 note. Both will be answered, some quicker than others. Thank you. We'll see you coming up next. Indeed.
Yep, thanks very much, Mike, and thanks, Benj, for setting the scene for the session today as well. I am just going to give a little bit of background to Port of Cromarty Firth and build very much on what Benj was saying about the success that we have already had in the industry, but also thinking about what is to come. Port of Cromarty Firth was set up 50 years ago this year, actually, as a trust port. And the concept behind it was the government wanted to make sure that the communities in the north of Scotland were able to take full advantage of the opportunities from North Sea oil and gas that were to come. And really that proposition still holds true today in terms of making sure that our communities benefit and our businesses benefit from the energy industry, albeit that energy industry is changing. We are a port literally in transition. So when I joined the port 8 years ago, I haven't quite been in renewables as long as Benj. We were 70% oil and gas, and today we're about 30% oil and gas. So we have seen it is a managed decline, and we do see oil and gas continuing to be a really important part of our business. But renewables has really filled the gap. So renewables is currently sitting about 30% of our business. And you can see on the photograph behind me, this was taken a few months ago. It's the Moray West offshore wind farm, and that's the monopiles that were being marshalled on our site in Invergordon. Each one of those, just for a sense of size and scale, is about 90 metres long. They're about 10 metres in diameter, and the heaviest was 2,000 tonnes. So we had to be able to accommodate 62 of those monsters. You can see how many they can get on a ship when they arrive. So the most we had on the vessels that came through were 8, mostly coming from China, but some of them were delivered from Spain as well. So there's a lot of success already happened. This is a very recent project between ourselves and Nigg Energy Park, which also sits within the port's waters. We've the best track record in supporting these large marshalling work scopes for offshore wind in Scotland. For ourselves, we've been supporting the wind industry since 2005, actually, in onshore wind. So we've actually got 20 years of experience already in dealing with wind farms and the different components coming through. The Cromarty Firth itself, in a number of industry and government reports, has been identified as a national strategic hub for offshore wind due to the water depths, the sheltered water. You can see on the photograph here, we have a history of storing oil rigs either coming into stack or mainly for inspection, repair and maintenance. We're a big O&M hub for oil rigs, and they come in because of the shelter. You can see the headlands on the photograph there, and the two headlands kind of almost put their arms around the Firth and make it a very sheltered body of water, which is really important for anything to do with large components when you're moving them around, but will be incredibly important for floating wind in the future when you're trying to integrate turbines on top of floating substructures. We talk a lot about collaboration, and I dread using that word, but we proved that that collaboration can work through the Inverness and Cromarty Firth Green Freeport. We were successful in achieving Green Freeport status last January. The Prime Minister came up to announce that we were one of the two Green Freeports in Scotland, and that is a cluster of 6 ports working together to try and secure as much local content as we can for local people and local businesses. Some of you probably heard the announcement today of the Scottish Offshore Wind Ports Alliance, which really extends that collaboration across the whole of Scotland. There's a large number of ports working together to, again, make sure that Scotland is able to capitalise, but also we're able to go to the market with a unified offering and real clarity on the infrastructure that is available, because we are conscious, I think every report you read says there's not enough port infrastructure. And I'll just finish with what Port of Cromarty Firth ourselves have been doing about that infrastructure. So you can see on here we're already able to take the largest, the wind farm components that are coming through, but all of the wind farm components are getting larger and larger. And of course, as we move to floating wind, there's an increasing requirement for port space. So we did try to future-proof this development that you can see. It cost us about £50 million. We built it in 2 halves. We went out to the industry and said, how big are these ships going to get? How big are these monopiles going to get? And we built the maximum size that we were able to afford at the time on the assurances from industry nothing was going to get any bigger. And when we finished the development in 2021, everybody said, it's absolutely wonderful, one of the best port facilities in the UK. Can we now have it twice the size? So we are now in the process of planning our expansion. We're looking at least another 5 hectares. This one's going to cost us over 100 million, such as inflation and the cost of construction. And we've been successful in securing provisionally FLOMIS funding. We're one of the 2 ports in the UK that has secured FLOMIS funding from the UK government, and we're just working through our due diligence on that. So it's a really exciting time to be in this industry at the moment, but of course it's not without our challenges, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those challenges in the questions.
It's almost selling Cromarty Firth as a holiday destination, isn't it, really? So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, so I'm actually from very close to Barrow, which is where Ben was talking about his first wind farm was, and I moved up to the Highlands, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best place on earth to live and work. You get views like that, you get amazing wildlife, the weather is actually better than most people think, so I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to attract those skilled workers that Ben is after to enjoy an amazing quality of life in an incredible place.
What's not to like? Thank you very much indeed. So we'd like to pick up now with Siemens, Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, from one holiday destination to another. Yeah, my name is Andrew Elms. Thank you for the opportunity to join the panel. I represent Siemens Energy in the UK, and the reason we've got double logo up on there is because Siemens Gamesa, the wind turbine business that was the Siemens Wind Power, is now fully part of Siemens Energy. So we ourselves are in a transition of merging the 2 businesses, and we represent effectively the mainstay of the energy transition and the electrical offering of the future. Everything from the wind turbines that Siemens Gamesa produces through to electrolyzers, transformers, and even the hydrogen-ready and hydrogen-capable gas turbines that we've always historically produced. So in itself, an energy transition example. Specifically talking about wind, though, and offshore wind, we are the market leader for offshore wind, and especially in the UK, where we have some 70% of the installed capacity. There are 24, I think we've got about 24 gigawatts installed globally, of which around 10 of those are in the UK. So you can see how important the UK market is for us. And as a result of that, we became and took an early lead in becoming the biggest investor in the UK's supply chain for the offshore wind industry. So the picture behind me is the result of £500 million worth of investment in a port in Hull, extending a little bit of the British riverbed and redeveloping an old coal terminal into an offshore wind blade plant. So again, another example of the energy transition, and recruiting and training 1,000 staff that were working in all industries, various and nothing to do with offshore wind, but putting them to work in handcrafting offshore wind turbine blades. We now employ, and by the end of this year, we'll have 1,200 people directly employed in the factory, and then another few hundred at least in direct roles. And we've produced more than 2,000 blades there since we started production back in 2016, the first blades coming out for an Ørsted project, Racebank. We also have there, though, and often missed in that picture, just off the picture, is we have a training centre there where we dedicate to upskilling our own employees, but also bringing in new entrants into the industry. We take on hundreds of apprentices every year, and we spend around £5 million a year on R&D for the wind business in the UK, where we collaborate with around 4 universities, again, some of those overlapping with Ørsted. So that background image next to it, I've kind of spliced on there amateurly another success of the supply chain this year, because Moray is getting some cheap plugs actually today, aren't they? Moray West is getting some cheap advertising, because that turbine is the first one installed for Moray West, and those blades, all 108 metres long of them, are being made at that factory in Hull now, after our latest £200 million investment. And again, a chuck up to Moray, that's a CFD4 project that in less than 2 years has gone from receiving that contract to actually installing turbines and hopefully getting them spinning by the end of this year. However, this industry, and I think just to pick up on Joanne's point, it is one of constant growth. And we invested in that plant and tried to future-proof it for blades that would be 75 up to 80 metres long. We couldn't get the capex together, and that's a similar story to do bigger, even though we knew it was coming. We're part of the decision to make it bigger. And so we've had to invest 3 times now, and the most recent one to get it to 108 metres. We actually want and need to invest again. So sometime in the next couple of years, we want to move to the 115 metre blade for the projects that have come on the back of CFD 4 and 6. The paradox is, though, that we are a business that is making a loss. Partly our own faults, so through sort of chasing the larger turbine, partly through some of our own growing pains for increasing the capacity, like the factory in Hull, but also because we, as an industry, have accepted that we're going to plummet the costs and we're going to sort of cut away beyond the fat and into the meat and bone of our own futures. So paradoxically, that means we don't have the capex to invest for the future capacity that the industry needs, and now globally. And what's also costing us is a little bit of that free bandwidth to work on industries like floating offshore wind, which desperately needs our input to make sure that our turbines can support those foundations. But of course, each small floating project demands a lot of resource, and we need to focus on some of the volume that is going to get us to the 50 gigawatts by 2030. So a real paradox for us and a challenging situation. So to bring it to what the UK needs, and that's I think what this kind of panel is looking to conclude is, or explore, is how do we get a healthy UK supply chain? What we want from it is commitment to an annual pipeline. They don't have to be record volumes, they have to be consistent and predictable and reliable volumes. So call it that 5 gigawatts a year that we keep going to, and we need that pipeline to be extended to commit out to at least 2035. We're already in the decision points of 2030 and possibly have lost that opportunity. So let's look to 2035 and keep the momentum going. And that way, with those consistent annual pipeline of projects, the supply chain can look at it and can invest for capacity rather than for project. The CFD, and I think to reflect Jonathan Cole's words this morning, we need clear signals on the energy transition. We don't need, we ourselves are competing for investment as an internal company in the UK, alongside other companies that where Siemens Energy operates. And any loss of certainty, loss of commitment that the UK shows undermines our own ability to persuade our lords and masters internally that they should invest in the UK, where the market and the policy and the framework should be the most consistent. We need pound-wise focus on the route to market, on the value of offshore wind. Instead of penny-wise and scrimping on budgets that end up with capacity and money left on the table, let's agree on a reasonable price for electricity and get that offshore wind capacity delivered sooner rather than waiting for the nuclear and the gas and the other solutions that are now more expensive and are going to come later and are going to mean that energy payers, bill payers are paying more for longer. We need regular, swift and dependable funding support for the supply chain. Everything that's been talked about in the CFD needs to cascade from the developer to the supply chain, and we need something a bit more direct than that. GIGA, SIR, Sustainable Investment Awards, the supply chain plan for the CFD, that is not an excuse for the lack of an industrial policy, and I think that's what that industrial strategy is what we've needed and we want to go back to. So we can have public and private input to funding that will go straight to the supply chain and invest ahead of capacity. Again, similar to some of the points you've heard. We'll talk a little bit more, and I think the questions about how we respond, and then we can get the responses we did now 10 years ago when we decided to invest in Hull. And if we get back to that situation, we can get that security supply, we can create those 100,000 jobs, as Benj mentioned. We can work on the infrastructure, like Joanne is talking about, to get ahead of the curve and the net zero targets for fixed and floating offshore wind out to 2050. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A lot of points there to raise, including one I couldn't resist. We'll come back to what's a reasonable price for electricity to discuss. In a political year, that's a very interesting question. So maybe last slide, sorry, I apologise. Last slide, and we hear from Equinor. Thank you.
Thank you, yes, and really pleased to be here. Good to see everyone. I guess the curse of going last on a panel of very competent people is all of the very good and eloquent points are taken. So I won't take up time repeating many of them. Maybe I'll wholeheartedly endorse some of them, but I'm also maybe going to flag that I love Mike's confidence in us that we have the answers. If we had the answers, we wouldn't necessarily be sitting here today, but hopefully we can have some views which will stimulate debate. I think maybe the thing that struck me, something I read quite recently, is that the UK, we've deindustrialised at the fastest rate of all of the G7 countries in the last few years. And I think that's kind of compounded by the unrelenting focus on cost, which we've seen through the CFD, the competitive process that projects have been going through, has really all been at the expense of our domestic supply chain. And, Andrew's obviously raised that point in terms of wind turbines, but that's across the piece in terms of our supply chain contributions to offshore wind. That's not to say that there isn't the optimism and positive view from industry, from government, that this can be reversed to a certain extent. And, we'll touch on it a few more times, I'm sure, through discussion. But, the IGP, the Industrial Growth Plan, is a really positive step in that direction in terms of trying to identify, where the UK has the strength and capabilities to really develop some of those supply chain areas and maybe disrupt some new areas as well. And where we can really bring that predicted £25 billion of GVA back to the UK. I think it's not all about financial either. I think, we're really seeing energy security issues and having some of those components of our supply chain within the UK would help in those respects. But also, the huge amount of infrastructure that's on the critical path now. And again, I'm sure we'll come to this more through the panel discussions, but things like, long lead times for HVDC cabling, it means that developers have to put, potentially orders in up front before we've got the projects de-risked, before we know that we've got a consent, before we know that we've got a CFD. And that all adds not only to, the risk of the project, but also to the cost, which ultimately gets passed on to the consumer, because that risk is all built into the project economics. So I think developing the domestic supply chain is really not just about individual companies. It really is about bringing forward the industry as a whole together. I think one key thing that I'd like to draw out as well, I'm just Equinor to flag, it's a Norwegian state-owned company, headquartered, Equinor UK, headquartered in Aberdeen for the last 40 years, but it's a company in transition. So historically, oil and gas, really looking to pivot to be a broad energy company, have half of CapEx spending on renewables and low-carbon solutions by 2030, and net zero by 2050. Now that's going to mean a huge change. The UK is a strategic market for us in terms of offshore wind, and you can see on the slide here the operational projects we've got, High Wind Scotland, which was the first commercial scale floating project. Also Sheringham Shoal and Dudgeon in operation, and several projects in development as well, not least Dogger Bank with our partners SSE in Vargaron, which will be coming forward to operation over the coming years. I think maybe the journey we've been through, take Hywind Scotland for example, fantastic, technologically innovative, one of the first commercial scale floating projects to get off the ground. However, maybe not such a local content success. We can be honest about that. I wasn't with Equinor at the time. It's been in operation since 2017, but the discussions, as I understand it, really tried to get sort of Scottish companies engaged, but because it was 5 turbines, because it was a first in terms of technology, the supply chain just wasn't there. And the supply chain wasn't willing to invest because there was no pipeline for floating. Now we have, I think it's 25 gigawatts of floating in Scotland. So obviously that is a completely different story. So, really having that certainty of supply chain, as Andrew touched on, I think is going to be critical for helping those investment cases. I think it's important to realise as well is we talk about supply chain as kind of one piece, but there's many different scales. So through my role, I'm really lucky to be able to sit as industry sponsor on the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership, sort of a smaller scale initiative, but it's really looking to invest in the lower tier manufacturing, innovation products to accelerate the UK supply chain, both through grant funding, but also business transformation. And £19 million of funding has gone into that to date. A few weeks ago, I was really lucky to get round some of those companies and see what the funding had gone on to. And, it's really transformational to see, what might seem like a small investment to a developer or to government, how actually that can make a huge difference to a business. For example, a new piece of lifting equipment opens up a whole spectrum of vessel sizes that can be repaired or constructed and so on. So sort of really understanding that smaller scale is important. Also then sort of up to the larger scale, so take Dogger Bank as an example, 9 billion capex investments, some really significant contracts let there. And you can see here on the slide, this was a contract we let with North Star, which is Aberdeen headquartered, to provide 4 service operation vessels, SOVs, to service the Dogger Bank project through its operational lifetime. So that was a £350 million contract with North Star, previously an oil and gas supplier, vessel supplier, which again really helped them pivot in the energy transition to move into offshore wind and have that kind of certainty and security to make that investment. Maybe to pick up on a few points that haven't been referenced so far as much, but in terms of funding and investment, I think this might be a question that comes up again through the discussion, but how do we pay for this? I think there's recognition that this is a joint problem. It needs a joint solution. And again, I'm going to shamelessly steal from Jonathan Cole from this morning before lunch. I think I liked his phrase about public funding crowding in private investment instead of crowding it out. So I think we need to frame some structures about how we bring money in for investment for the supply chain. This can't be done on a project-by-project basis. We really need to look at how we pay for supply chain outside of those project constructs. By the time a project's de-risked, by the time a project's got its CFD, by the time it's taken its financial investment decision and it's got money to spend, that's too late for a port, for a turbine manufacturer, for even lower tier suppliers to actually then find their investment funding, take their investment decisions, and still keep to the timelines that the project wants to. So in terms of the Sustainable Industry Rewards, which currently are going to be mandatory to be eligible for a contract for difference, developers are required to contract with projects in deprived areas to make financial investments. It's likely that they're not going to be for those specific projects. It's like a pay-it-forward principle. And developers are fine to fund that. I think the key thing that we really need to see is it's a level playing field. So developers are funding the supply chain across the board. There's no competitive advantage. And that gives the supply chain the certainty to actually make those investments, maybe for future projects, maybe for the wider industry. I think finally, just the one point to pick up, totally agree on certainty of pipeline. I won't dwell on that again. But I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's really about, unlocking a lot of these project barriers and making sure that we can deliver the projects we need to in the timely fashion and having the supply chain there. And that kind of tying all those timelines in together is not easy. But if we can start to maybe pull some of this funding and draw on public funding, industry funding, private investment funding and so on, I think that will be the success to bringing forward the industry that we need along with the decarbonisation of the UK. I shall leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Melissa. Very interesting. I'll tell you, I'm really neutral and move to that one rather than, just that safe, isn't it, rather than us lodging in any one company. But I think you raised some very interesting challenges, all of you. The questions this afternoon have been coming in and focusing a mixture on technology, some curiosity on investment. And I'd like to sort of unlock the conversation in two parts, first of all. Investment, and then sort of really how do we actually make that investment hit the nail on the head, if you like, for the companies and indeed the businesses out in the auditorium out there. And in terms of unlocking investment, the key investor clearly at the minute is the British government through the CFD mechanisms, but you also see, you don't hear a big complaint of lack of investment coming in, but as you get into the supply chain, that seems to be the biggest block. So a hell of a pace ahead of us. We need to get pretty much one wind turbine installed per day, every day between now and 2030 to hit the targets we've got, and then keep going beyond then to make our wider net zero targets. But if we look into the supply chain, interesting here, we've got some thoughts on investment in infrastructure, but are there parts of the supply chain that really need investment at the minute that we've missed in the conversation so far? We've touched on blades, but things like the towers and the structures, not just in their assembly, but the manufacture of them in the first place. Some bits seem well fed and we're not talking about the cables, but what are the areas we're not talking about that we really need in the supply chain to focus on investment to really make a difference? Any thoughts? Ben?
I'll have a go. So everything, I suppose, is the
Well,
simple answer. We need more of everything. By the way, I'm sure there's lots of supply chain players in this audience. You're probably thinking, oh, I've had however long, half an hour of motherhood and apple pie, and everything sounds wonderful from up here. It would be great if you could challenge us with some questions about what it is that we as developers or as ports, or indeed as tier one parts of the supply chain, what are we not getting right? What is stopping you from breaking in and building up your capability in the offshore wind sector? But to come back to your question, Mike, it's really difficult. I'm just going to focus on floating. I mean, fixed bottom offshore wind is global, so kind of a truism, isn't it? The UK needs to get as much capacity into its domestic supply chain as it possibly can because there is such a shortage, and various speakers this morning talked about that. We need to crowd in investment. We kind of have a bit of a broken system at the moment in fixed bottom because the prices have historically driven out a healthy return for the supply chain, and I don't need to tell Andrew that, he's fessed up himself. So we need to find a way to fix this. We need to find a way to make sure that that consumers pay a fair price for electricity. It's, by the way, still cheaper, a lot cheaper than relying on fossil fuels. So offshore wind is a good deal, even if it's at sustainable prices that enable the supply chain to make sustainable returns and invest in growth in capacity. But just turning to floating, I think floating wind is going to be big, as I mentioned earlier. And to your question, what do we need to invest in? We need to invest in ports and FlowMIS, and a lot of support from Scottish Government sitting alongside that. One of the things that didn't get much talk about when there was a question about de-risking floating in this morning's session was about as in the in bit of INTOG. The whole point of these projects is that we get them moving quickly. We start to use the UK, the Scottish and the UK supply chain. We have learnings that are anchored, pardon the pun, in this country, in this economy, so that the skills that we've built up in oil and gas and that we developed from scratch to support floating wind, things like foundation design, how do you actually manufacture it? How do you do the logistics in a port? How do you do the installation? Where the hell are you going to store them all while you're waiting to install them? There are a load of questions, and the in projects are absolutely crucial. And obviously I'm passionate about it because I sit on the board of one of them. We really need to get them in the water. We need to get them moving so that the UK supply chain is the first supply chain to learn about how to do this, how to invest, where to invest. I think that can give us a real national and international advantage. And I know, thinking about the Cabinet Secretary's comments this morning, it's great to hear the Scottish Government wants to collaborate. I've experienced a really strong collaboration myself working with various directorates, Scottish Government, but we need to do more of that, and we need to get our skates on, because the rest of the world is not ignoring floating. They are coming, and if we don't get in front of them, they will get in front of us.
I think a lot of people say that fixed bottom wind is a tough gig to get into if you're not already all into it. So how you change, that's one thing. And floating wind, indeed, new game, sort of same heritage in one sense. But I don't know, Melissa, when you think about it from your point of view in Equinor, how much of the solution for you for floating wind can you actually get done in the UK? And it's going to be great to see what happens in ports, but actually the hard steel in the first, the things you can kick, how many of the things can you kick can you actually originate in the UK rather than just assemble and then get offshore?
Teed me up very nicely, thank you.
You see, I'm an engineer at heart.
Yeah, I was reading the OE UK supply chain report from this year, actually, and in terms of expenditure, there's 58% of floating offshore wind can be transferred directly from oil and gas. So I think that's a really, tangible number. More than half of the kind of existing oil and gas expenditure and floating structures can be directly transferable. So that's things. Vessels, I mean, North Star's a good example of one I've just referred to, but subsurface, the foundation types, the moorings, the anchorings, all the things that Benj touched on, but also the kind of the services. We focus quite a lot on manufacturing so far, but I think things like, the engineering services, the environmental services, and this is one of the key pillars of the industrial growth plan as well. It's in terms of real disruption of, of those kind of environmental services, seismic surveys and so on. And, can we use innovation to really lead in the UK? And that's an area which, the industry working with supply chain identified as, maybe slightly smaller on the capex side of things, but a real niche area that the UK should be leading on. So I think sort of in terms of the infrastructure that we've talked about, yes, but also the service provisions as well.
It's going to be certainly very interesting to see. I'll come back to what I was looking at in the conference hall in a minute, but Andrew, from your own point of view, we were chatting just before the session. Siemens is based, their factory is based, their office is based in Parsons, CA Parsons site from of old, and now most people in the room will not have heard of them. They too made turbines. Theirs was steel and fueled by coal, I think it was in the old days. Never mind water, but certainly coal. So, you're part of a heritage, but do you find enough within the northeast of England in terms of support for your part of the supply chain?
Not enough for the offshore wind supply chain, no. Although, in a nice bit of circularity, we just brought some generators in from our offshore direct drive turbine into Newcastle to have them repaired there instead of where they would normally go on, which is back to either Germany or Denmark. So that part of the integration of Siemens Energy, Siemens Gamesa is looking for those opportunities to increase the kind of UK contribution of it, and indeed keep costs down and transport costs, etc. So that's a nice bit of circularity that the turbines are coming back, wind turbines are coming back to Parsons to be repaired in order to go back out into onshore wind turbines. There is, the offshore wind, the wind industry grew up in Denmark, and that had a 30-year head start on the UK of establishing from an agricultural through to an industrial basis for that engineering, and therefore they've of course developed and embedded, entrenched that IP and indeed the governmental support and the whole culture and infrastructure required. So we've got a bit to catch up on there. We've done that in Hull, and now we have the expertise from Hull being sent to help our factory in Le Havre get up to speed, being sent to our new factories, and indeed the sort of learnings and the quality improvements and the technology suggestions being sent to our headquarters to then improve the design that comes back round and is then assembled back in Hull. So it kind of, once you've got that established footprint, it becomes part of the ecosystem of continuous improvement and innovation. So once you build it, it will come, I think I will say in that sense, as long as you can get your factories up to capability of exporting, and therefore they're wiping their face and contributing to the centre. And I'll just come back to your question about the supply chain. What should we make? I think what we don't need to do is commission any more reports. We've got Tim's report, which then led to the IGP, which in itself suggests what we should make, buy, build. And indeed the supply chain capability analysis that was it OWIC, I think, sponsored, that therefore has come out that the 92 billion opportunity by 2035, I think it is, or 2040, that it suggests out. And indeed in parallel, because it wouldn't be trusted to have just industry commission that, DESNZ did its own study, which launched on the same day as IGP, was a bit confusing.
I've got the two.
There's plenty out there that we said, if only we just put them like acetates and said, where's the overlap, just go on and do it. I'm sure we'll get generally there. But if we were to do nothing else than invest in our ports, we build them and it will come. Because for offshore wind, you're not going to do anything that's not port-based, and therefore if we start investing in that, we need the space, as Ben says, for at least the fixed and floating. And on top of that space and in the hinterland behind, we can then attract the supply chain that invests to capitalise on the ports.
Do you find you have all you need then, Joanne? The other folks on the panel are saying, cut the chat, I won't say anything ruder than that, get on with it. Do you find you've got what you need? Because we have to move at one heck of a pace. And, trying to pick up a sort of a marathon when they're all sprinting past you to get into the floating wind space. Do you find you've got what you need?
I'm delighted to hear everybody on the panel saying how much we need ports. And we're moving as fast as we can. FLOMIS is driving some quite incredible timelines. So we've been awarded provisionally, as I say, up to £55 million. We've actually got to spend that money by the end of Q1 2026. We haven't submitted our EIA at this point. We haven't gone out to tender for the construction because we didn't know whether the money was coming, and if it was, what the quantum was going to be. So there's some quite big chunky things that we've got to get through before we can actually start building. We suspect we can only start building Q3, Q4 2025. So we've got a very short space of time to spend £55 million. It's quite a nice problem to have, and I did say to my boss that I did quite fancy a new shoe wardrobe, but even that's some going, by my standards, to spend that amount of money. But I think where we're struggling, we're a 12 million turnover trust port. We don't have the balance sheet to just go ahead and build a £100 million expansion. And you can imagine what our banks would say if we went to them and said, can you just loan us £100 million? They want to see contractual commitments in order to support that debt finance. And that's where some of these things start to fall over a little bit, because you're having to say to developers, you haven't reached your CFD, you haven't reached your FID, but actually if you want this port infrastructure to be in place, you need to sign a contract, you need to sign a lease effectively at this point in time in order for us to build the infrastructure that you need to be ready in 2028, 2029. And we empathise with developers. That's a very uncomfortable position for them to be in. It's an uncomfortable position for us to be in. The government are obviously trying to help by putting money in through the FLOMIS scheme, but it's an interesting scenario where you're asking every single partner really to take quite a significant risk, especially when there is so much uncertainty around grid and consenting and what's going to happen with things like SERS. So it's like building a wind farm, probably, building a port. There are so many moving parts. It feels like you're trying to put a 3D jigsaw together and all the bits keep moving around. So it's the reason I have a lot more grey hair than I used to.
Interesting. I think if we look at the panel here and I check their balance sheets, I suspect they could find 100 million between them to help change
Only
your
a small amount.
nothing. Ben's looking very worried.
Thanks for that, Mike. That's really helpful.
I know, so there'll be
If
a whip
only we were
round.
making the returns of oil and gas.
There
then
will
we
be a
probably
whip round
would.
at the end of this. But joking apart, one of the big challenges in the wind sector compared maybe with traditional hydrocarbon is you can only be so venturesome because it's the nature of the business, the risk and reward profile is a different one. But we're being very bold in terms of the rate of growth we need, and that needs a bold step up in the rate of investment to make, say, your own port a leading port rather than a following port of what's trying to do. So is there a message to the government, Scottish or British, get your chequebook out, or forgive me, to one of the people this side of the table here, that we're going to have to find a way to be bold?
Well, I think Joanne's point is absolutely right. It is difficult to crowd in private sector funding if it's coming from project companies that don't have firm projects. There are other forms of investment, as one of your neighbours has demonstrated recently. So, yeah, you know, and back to Jonathan Cole's point around crowding in private money using public money, FLOMIS, you know, and I'm sure you'll look at this. I would love to see FLOMIS act as a catalyst for lots of private investment, but investment in a port. You know, we're project developers, we're not port owners, and nor should we be. You know, there's no doubt, we all know ports are the kind of literal and metaphorical foundations of the supply chain. We absolutely got to get them right. We've got to get them right quickly. But I don't think developers, Austin, funnily enough, when we were Dong Energy, we did invest in a port in Belfast, but we didn't do that until we got firm projects. The timelines, because of the scale, were so much smaller, were manageable. They simply aren't now, as you've said. But I do think there are other forms of private investment that can be crowded in. And, you know, we need to create the confidence of those investors that the projects will come, and that comes back to consenting. It comes back to grid, so that the revenues that you can show to a potential investor are backed up by us saying, yeah, we will come. We just don't quite know which of us when. And that's what's holding it back, I think.
I think there's also, in one sense, the big financial investments will work our way through, but investment isn't just the money side of things. It's investment in people, it's investment in places. I wouldn't mind just picking up a couple of those things as we go through some of these questions that are out here. And then some of the questions will focus on technology, repeatability, that sort of thing, which I think is very interesting to pick up on in a minute too. But investment in people, Ben, you talked a bit about skills, but I wonder, either from Equinor or indeed from Siemens, you talked again Siemens in terms of apprenticeships and the like, but how do you actually invest in the people to create a sustainable chain within your local communities? I don't know, Melissa, Andrew, I thought you could.
Yeah, I mean, skills for us are equally as important as supply chain. And, you know, if we look at our operational projects, you know, if we don't have the technicians going out, then obviously our revenue streams aren't going to be coming in. So, and that's sort of this capital recycled to go back into new projects. So, you know, it's critical in terms of, you know, right from the very early stage in the project development, through construction, through all of the supply chain and into operation. What I would say is, I think, you know, it's hard for the supply chain at the moment, and from what I've seen in terms of sort of peaks and troughs, because we're not a ring-fenced industry. So again, for example, I was in a relatively small fabrication factory a couple of months ago, and a lot of the welders there were from the Philippines. Not local people, and I was questioning this and sort of questioning, you know, why they hadn't brought in local people, and they said, well, they'd trained them all up, it was fantastic, and they've all gone off to work at Hinckley because nuclear pays much more than wind. So I think, you know, it's not just a case of the industry upskilling everybody, it's the case of the industry upskilling everybody and then being able to keep them in terms of pay, but also pipeline. And I know we keep banging on about this, but you know, it's that phrase, the drumbeat of projects coming through, which means the supply chain then also has that very consistent level, because all it takes is a slight drop off of work in terms of the offshore wind industry, and the skilled workers will look elsewhere. That there's many other parts of the industry, you know, parts of the UK that they could go and work in, or global. We're in a global industry. So I think that's really critical to think about in terms of skills. The other thing I'd just like to flag here, and I think this is as good a point as any, it's diversity in the skills, in the workforce. And I was on our SOV vessel a few months ago, and our offshore workers were exclusively male, 100%. There was not a single offshore technician that was represented as female. So it's a project we're working on internally in terms of identifying barriers for females going offshore, and really trying to, again, get into the schools really early to say, as part of the STEM activities, you know, to girls, you know, this is an option for you. You shouldn't think this is a male-dominated environment, and really starting to bring that through in terms of diversifying our skill base and also bringing new people into the markets.
So interesting. I'll come to Andrew. You're taking this, and particularly I wonder for Siemens, we talk about having a steady order book. You're a global company. Are there things you can do out of your site here in Newcastle that means you've got access to a European market? So if we've got a trough here, there's a peak there or whatever, how can you use local services to balance a European market out?
On the wind side, for our construction and major servicing operations, we do that anyway. We operate a global pool of technicians and specialists that will move to where the projects are. So a bit like those vessels that Adam talked about heading west, a lot of technicians would also have been going to do that, to be the specialists to install. And where we can, we establish third party up to the point of effectively our IP, our intellectual property control, and where we really think we need to have a Siemens Gamesa, Siemens Energy technician or expert involved with it. Otherwise, we look to have local third parties involved with it. So I guess that kind of model allows us to flex and manage the peaks and troughs. And they are literally peaks and troughs on big spreadsheets, as I seem to remember. They might have come up with something other than Excel now, but they were always Excel blue spreadsheets, I seem to remember. Just to bring it back to Hull, I don't want to sound kind of glib about this, but it was a model, a vignette of the energy transition. And I think the whole investment is 3 projects within a program. So build the ports, build the factory, and then staff the factory. And of that, I always say that the third project, staffing the factory, was the most impressive. Because how do you take 1,000 people from the Humber region, and 99% of them are from the Humber region? How do you take 1,000 people and turn them into blade craftsmen, craftspeople, workers? And actually, the diversity is not too bad. It's not what the sector deal wants us to have, but we've got a positive pay gap, which is one good thing, unless you're a bloke. But we took those 1,000 people, we recruited them for aptitude and attitude, not for knowledge of wind turbine composite blades. And we trained them for that constant improvement mentality, that team working, dexterity, communication skills, organizational skills. So all the skills that we should be producing school leavers with, we took them and we turned them into wind turbine blade craftspeople from all sorts of industries, caravan industry all the way through to engineering. And we're doing it again. The only reason I'm glib about that is because it's not a one-off where we set it up as a huge project and we would never do that again. We're now doing it again. This year, I think we've made something like 700 job offers in the Humber region to people who are going to come in and take that workforce up to the 1,200 that it will stabilize at for manufacturing the bigger blades. So we can do the energy transition when we get clear sight of, strong pipelines, strong certainty, order book that is going to be full, hopefully out to beyond 2030, and a certainty of the footprint that we have in the whole that we've established over the last 10 years, that will keep going.
Ben, and I just want to ask John one thing on that.
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn the tables on you, Mike. You've got vast experience of upstream oil and gas. When you look at how we're trying to build a supply chain for offshore wind, what are we missing? What are we not doing that we should be doing? You've got half a century of learning in your industry. There must be something we can take away from that we haven't already done.
I'll give you 4 decades. I'm not going to give the 5th just...
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying you've been there for all 5 decades.
Just 2 things I'd take. One, I'm afraid I have been around a while. As an engineer, I started work when most of the things I was working for Shell, you could actually source in the UK. We made the pumps, damn it, we made the compressors, we made the pipes, we made pretty much everything I do offshore. And we as a Cathcart, I sat there many a night commissioning water injection pumps on trials before we took them offshore, and that's all damn well gone. It really peeves me because the craftsman that you'd see in Newcastle, the skills has moved elsewhere. And then I look and I see, and you see it outside here, many of the smart things we retained in the UK. So I'm afraid the sticky up steel things were not as good as we should be at. But if you look at the subsea cabling, design, infrastructure, operations, hell, we're good at those, and those things are there. I'd like to think some of those are exportable and also durable here in the UK. I still have a bit of a nervous tick that we, high-tech end of the machinery side we've let go of. Maybe that's just a mature person's regrets, I don't know, but I just think those are both, we need them in the UK, we need them over Europe and beyond, they're exportable. So that's the one itch I've got that I think in the industrial growth plan, not quite touched. So we'll come back to that one maybe in a minute. But maybe just picking one thing, Andrew's got lots of people living near him, and he's giving all great jobs. It's a little less populated where you are, Joanne, so, you know, does it work for you as well in terms of access to people and skills?
So we get asked this all the time, but when you look back to what happened in Aberdeen, you know, there wasn't a lot in Aberdeen before oil and gas started, and there was a bit of a gold rush to Aberdeen because there were so many opportunities, really good pay, really good jobs that could take people around the world. And really, offshore wind is offering those same opportunities, and you get to live in amazing places. So I honestly think the people will come. I don't think that's naivety. I think that's just commercial reality, that if you want great opportunities, clean jobs, sustainable jobs in an exciting industry, then actually there's nowhere better than the northeast of Scotland at the moment. This is probably Scotland's biggest industrial opportunity. Some of the European countries are looking at this as their biggest industrial opportunity as well, and it's happening off our shores. I think what we want to try and make sure of is that we grab as much of that pipeline as we can and as much of that content as we can where it's sensible to do so. There are certain things we will always have to get abroad, but I think there are things that we can do nationally, and the great thing probably with floating wind is that it's a new supply chain. So there is an existing supply chain for onshore wind, there's an existing one for fixed bottom wind, and I think it's probably fair to say the UK didn't grasp as much of those supply chains as they should and could have. But we have another opportunity with floating wind, and we genuinely are going first. You know, other countries are looking at the UK and at Scotland in particular, and particularly in projects that Ben was talking about, to say, well, these are going to be the first commercial scale. So how, if we can develop those skills and if we can secure as much of that pipeline as we can, then I think, like Aberdeen and like Mike, I think you touched on earlier, you know, there are people who go out from Aberdeen all over the world who work in oil and gas, and why can we not have that same model apply in offshore wind, where we go first, so therefore countries around the world want those skills, and the best thing about that probably is that by exporting that expertise and those business opportunities and that the business services and products, that actually we're helping the world reach net zero, not just helping our own country reach net zero, which is a hell of a legacy for perhaps our generation to leave.
Thanks very much. I better not fail in my duty as a chairman to go through some of the sharper edged questions here, and you'd be amazed to hear there's a few with a slight political tinge to them. It's an election year, could be an election year for all sorts of things, who knows, but it's an election year, and there's a question about really, is that a good or a bad thing? Leaving aside the politics for the supply chain, you know, is there a danger we drop the ball? Or should we just simply pass the new government the industrial growth plan and say, keep going? I don't know.
I'm happy to make a couple of comments on that.
You started for 10 and then
yeah,
you're not going to be allowed to not.
So it's an opportunity.
Yeah.
You know, we don't know exactly when. It could even be next year, and we don't know, of course, what the outcome will be. But whatever party or parties form the next government, I think the one downside of being in an election cycle, this point in an election cycle, is the danger, as we are seeing, of energy being turned into a political football. And others have spoken about this as well. It has been amazing how much consensus we've had across the political spectrum in this country around the energy transition for 2 decades. You know, it was in the early noughties when we started to see consensus, and it has been very frustrating seeing that starting to fracture a little bit. So I suppose I would urge us to get on and have an election, and then we can all agree once again that the energy transition is a great thing. It's a highly investable industry, and it has political backing no matter who's in government. That's probably a better place to be than where we are right now.
And Melissa, without staying into politics, do you think it is a glitch, or can we just keep powering on, if you like, here?
Yeah, I think I would not stray into politics, but from our perspective, I think, you know, the narrative coming out of the Labour government in sort of draft manifestos and so on has been positive. There's talk of kind of mega leasing rounds, mega contract for difference rounds, the setting up of GB Energy, which is, you know, still hasn't really been formed in terms of reference, but, you know, it's another positive move in how Labour wants to sort of engage within the energy industry. But I think the key message is coming across from all parties is that the status quo should be maintained, and I think the industry is very lobbying hard for that too. You know, we've got to a really good position, and maybe trying to reflect some of the positivity from, say, Claire Mack sort of this morning, and you know, I think we're moving in the right direction here in terms of the industrial growth plan. You know, we probably need a sort of wider industrial strategy to really pull offshore wind into the narrative about net zero and decarbonisation and how all of those supply chains work together. But yeah, the kind of the view from the industry generally, I think, is that as long as we can maintain that status quo, we should be positioned quite well as an industry. Yeah.
And Andrew, you're lucky enough to have a mayor or two breathing over your shoulder as well as the British government. So do you have any perspective on the elections just gone or elections to come?
And I think, well, the region where we're in, certainly for our wind side, is strongly one colour already anyway, so I don't think we're going to see a disruption there. But I actually might be worth just bringing that back to, even if it were of different colour, back to Benja's point about the consistency and the kind of agreement across all parties, the consensus. That's one of the things that was a contributor to allowing us to invest in the first place. We had the consistent commitment from local and national government, and local government in the Humber entails a whole sort of bag of cats in a sack of vying for funding and for kind of preeminence between a number of authorities and the city. And yet that all came together in order to seize the prize that was our investment. So I think if we keep them focused on the prize of lower energy bills through consistent CFD rounds and don't interfere to that, allow the civil service to carry on pushing that through and just tick off the budgets no matter whether we're in a kind of pre-election or post-election phase. I think if we get another party coming in, there'll be a lot more focus obviously on jobs. And on the GB Energy, which in itself could be a support to funding public and private. But one thing we must do is just see the value of cheaper electricity and a future electricity which comes from offshore wind. And I trust that the sensible minds in there know that and will keep that going despite some of the game playing.
And my picture of cats in a sack, I think it's a cats, not rats, but cats in a sack is an interesting one to take away, if nothing else, from this afternoon. On the funding side of things, though, there's a sort of side question about whether FlowMIS is actually hitting all of the targets and needs at the minute. Are you happy with FlowMIS as a funding vehicle?
Well, since I'm about to try and extract 55 million out of UK government, of course, I'm going to say I think it's wonderful.
Excellent, good. So that's a simple question.
It would be remiss of me to say anything else right now.
Yeah, so we get a resounding tick, and I think the message is the next government keep going on that one.
Yeah, I think, so for us, I totally agree with everybody on the panel in terms of that certainty and clarity. I think business, that's what business always wants, is that clarity, surety of policy as well. It is a bit trickier up here because we've got two governments to deal with, so making sure that there is that consistency and that consistent message to business. For us as Port of Cromarty Firth, we have a rather acute concern about an election and when the timing of that election may be, because the Secretary of State has to sign our grant offer letter for FlowMIS. So, of course, if there is an election called, there is a pre-election period. during which they can't sign anything. And of course, if we have a change of Secretary of State, whether we have a change of government or not, we may have a change of Secretary of State. So there's actually quite a concerning potential delay. And if that letter isn't signed when we hope it's going to be signed, then actually we really struggle to spend the money. So I don't echo Benji's call for an immediate election in that regard, purely from a selfish point of view. But I totally agree that that consistency of message, an understanding politically of just the size of this prize for UK PLC in terms of jobs and business opportunities, and making sure that we go first, and continuing with that consistency of policy.
Sorry, yeah.
I just wanted to add to the FLOMIS discussion as well, and I think it's great. Cromarty Firth, obviously you're a winner. 2 winners were selected. There other ports weren't selected, which is a difficult position to be in. But I think this is a common theme that's coming through in a lot of the reports that you're referencing. I think the UK needs to pick winners to be successful. I think we can't be everything to everyone in terms of the industry, and there is a limited pot of funding. There is ultimately a limited amount of projects, and I think to be able to then sort of select the areas or the projects or the types of infrastructure where we really can make a difference in the UK to our kind of UK PLC, I think is going to be the difficult decisions that the government has to make, or the relevant funding providers, be it Crown Estate, private funders, investors, and so on. So I think that's maybe the elephant in the room. It's about the competitive nature, and there are going to be losers as well.
But if we have repeated cyclical funding, then you don't have to be a winner this time, but maybe your case can come. And I think that's our challenge with the kind of FLOMIS and OMIS scheme. And well done, Joanne. We haven't been as successful with government funding, and maybe we should come and talk. That they kind of seem flash in a pan, and then you've got to wait. Well, do you know when the next one's coming along? So we missed that bus. Is there another one coming? We know that the industry is going to continually grow, continually evolve, and need support in some form. And therefore, there should be cyclical, predictable funding where maybe you have a chance to go for it. And if you miss it this time, there's something coming next time. So that's part of the certainty, along with the CFD, the route to market, but also the route to support and funding.
I think the funding mechanisms and the dynamics have got us this point now to the CFDs are going to have to continue to evolve, I think, to a more market-based mechanism over the longer term. And there will be some hiccups on the way. Ben,
Yeah, I just want to bring it back to the industrial growth plan, because what you're kind of talking about is an industrial strategy that has a regular rhythm that enables the priorities set out in the industrial strategy to be delivered. And I think that's what IGP can do, because it is going to be a collaboration. It's not pooling money, but it is pooling ambition and pooling focus areas. There are different complementary sources of funding: private sector, public sector, national government, devolved administrations. It's all got to work together, but against a coherent long-term plan. I think that's the bit that we've been missing. There have been some fantastic initiatives like FLOMIS, like many other initiatives, both OWGP, but they have not been pulled together into coherent story, a coherent narrative that creates winners.
And I think, just plain, you asked me earlier about oil and gas experience. I originally started working in the electricity industry as a designer of steam turbines, and not with the original James Watt. I wasn't later than that, but in those days we still had the Central Electricity Generating Board as our core customer. So there was a sort of statist planner of what we were trying to do, and the oil and gas sector was been mayhem in the UK compared with, say, if you look in the Netherlands, you see a very much, or Norway, you see a very much more orderly rollout of infrastructure, and they have a more efficient and, dare I say, a more cost-effective system because of doing that. The devil may take slightly marketeer-driven solutions all the parties have adopted does mean that long-term costs may be sometimes higher, and certainly that mayhem makes certain problems. I think there are some lessons to learn from our European neighbours, or even our longer-term past, in what we're trying to achieve. I'd like to, there's a couple of really good, just nice gold bread and butter technical ones that I like doing here. One of which is, for heaven's sake, we stop making the turbines bigger and just make them all the same size. Andrew, you make turbine blades. Would you like them just all to be the same size so you can really churn them out?
And it is a perennial on this one. So we'll stop doing that, and then I'll say to the developer, if somebody else comes along and offers you a bigger one, are you going to take ours or theirs? So, and then Benj will say, well, if we agree we'll only ever take a 115, what will our competitors do when they get a 120 metre blade and therefore a turbine that comes along with that? And then the UK says, well, okay, we'll stick with only having an envelope of 120 metre blades with turbines that come to that. Developers, you can only do that. And developers will look at another national market and say, we can get more money for our electricity by playing in that market. So it is, I'm afraid, a kind of, you know, it's an arms race in that sense, from all the way from national down to the tip of your blade. I think there's an opportunity to say that for batches of auctions, and that's being looked at now to say, right, between this period here, the UK would say we will only clear a tip height of a turbine offshore to this, and therefore that gives you an envelope of this length of blade, therefore this rating of turbine, therefore you can, to an extent, standardise. But I'll come back to the standardised point after you maybe let other people have a comment.
So I have a question for you then, Andrew, which is, because the way you implement it is with the tip height limit, but how much can you drive performance up and cost out by industrialising a particular product line? Yeah. Because you say, you know, a company like Equinor also will just go off and buy a bigger machine from somewhere else, not if you've industrialised and actually the levelised cost of electricity that we can produce is lower with your industrialised, optimised performance machine. I don't know if that's a credible
and that's I'll respond on that. And I think that's what you're going to see happening now. We've seen that curve has started to flatten through, you know, people's kind of misadventures or whatever. We've certainly delayed bringing any other turbine onto market for a little while. And we're taking that approach now, saying let's get down the cost curve of the investments we've made into that infrastructure. Let's increase the capacity for everything for that infrastructure, and then therefore kind of really kind of sweat the asset of, say, a 115 metre blade product, which will be the sort of 15 megawatt turbine that is going to be the next workhorse. I mean, I was at Whiteley Wind Farm yesterday for an event, and I haven't been back there since 2008, since we've built it. And those 2.3 megawatt turbines we produced then, we were churning them out. They were such a serial workhorse, and they're a brilliant machine. And you just look at them, and they just keep running, and they're there, you know, churning out the megawatts per day. And we've raced away from that as part of the kind of gold rush of offshore. And I guess we're going to see that flattening. But it does come back to the question of, well, if somebody's going to look across the horizon and see, well, Mingyang are offering me a 22 megawatt turbine, am I going to turn it down? I think that's where you're always going to have that challenge. But yes, one of the ways we can try and do it is bring the price of the turbine down by getting down the cost curve of our investments.
And waiting for Amazon to be able to supply a blade when you can't do it for them. So we've got a Chinese copy from somewhere else. Who knows? That will come one day. You know, Melissa, from your point of view, standard sizes, standard solutions, is Equinor good at standard?
I mean, obviously, as much as you can standardise and bring the cost down, the better. I think we would always just look at the most cost-effective approach. So, you know, especially with floating, for example, the largest turbines aren't necessarily the best because the foundation that you need to put them on ends up costing, you know, more than the energy capture you get from the larger machine. So I don't think it's quite as straightforward for floating as in larger turbines are always going to be the best. So obviously we have to build a business case, and we would look at all the turbines on the market, is my very non-committal answer.
So the engineers still get a little bit of a look in nonetheless, thank goodness. I don't know, from your own case, Joanne, would you love to have a standard business rather than, you know, the bespoke solutions that keep coming knocking in your door?
I think we're effectively a landlord, so what the developers do with the land, we're fairly ambivalent about. I think where it makes a difference for us is on floating. So we're obviously one of the primary sites for inshore anchorages. So if you're building floating substructures, then needing to store them before you do the integration. And actually, at the moment, we can't really even look at moorings for those because there are so many different types. So I think it would help from a standardisation point of view. And of course, if we were doing fabrication and assembly or assembly of those floating substructures, and whether we might do that at Invergord, and they'll certainly, I think, do that at Ardisia, possibly at NIG as well, probably at NIG, they would probably benefit from that standardisation. And there is a question mark around if one of the manufacturers goes first and sets up a fabrication facility in Scotland, actually do some of the developers then say, well, you've done half of the work for us, so we'll just buy your floating substructures. So yeah, we're interested on one side, but ambivalent on the other, I suppose.
Hedging your floating bets.
Yes.
In a nice way. Yeah, good. We've got just over 10 minutes left. I'd like to pick up on a couple of themes, one of which, though, is we've not really talked about the operations and maintenance side of things. That's increasingly a big activity as you go further offshore in deeper waters. I think two things. One, the industrial growth plan focus on us trying to develop some real champions in the UK on that. We're brilliant at oil and gas operations and maintenance, and we see folks all over the world with Scottish or British pedigree doing that. But how do we get a really good set of champions in that here in the UK? And my son, my daughter, what would they see as a job out of that? Because in the end, it comes down, I've got two kids, one of whom will never go offshore, one of whom's partner goes offshore, and she's glad he goes sometimes, but they're both geophysicists. They want to understand what the work's going to look like in the years to come for them. They need to pay their own way in life, I'm pleased to say. So, yeah. You know, what's work going to look like, and can we get a good IRM out there?
Well, it's jobs for everyone. Jobs for everyone. Everything from lawyers to geophysicists to offshore technicians. I don't think we've been necessarily very good at engaging the next generation, and I particularly think about school age, actually, which I presume your children are, being quite a young man. I imagine we can do a lot more, and I think there are organisations like Engineering UK, who you may already work with. I think we as an industry, as an offshore wind industry, haven't really been out telling the story of the jobs of the future. And actually, as much about the jobs of the future, it's about the impact you can have in the future. One of the things I see through that generation that you're talking about is the need for purpose. And I think this is a sector that has that in spades. And we find it's quite good, particularly if you want diversity to come into the workforce, to talk about the why rather than the what, or at least first talk about the why and then the what. But I think we can do a lot more as an industry and as an energy sector more generally about the excitement of the mission that we're on here.
And I know one of my daughters has suddenly been involved in your company. How do you see the career paths going up? Because at the end of the day, as a parent, you want your children to have some great careers and futures, and you want, and as an individual, you want to see that path.
Yeah. And I think maybe traditionally the O&M side hasn't been seen as that sexy. You know, you're not kind of got the quick wins of getting a consent, getting a contract for difference, taking financial investment decision and so on. That, you know, the O&M side of it is kind of a day-on-day activity. But, you know, it is the real kind of job creation and that longevity of job creation. I think on Dogger Bank, just from our perspective, once operational, we'll have 400 employees working purely on the O&M, and that's without any of the kind of knock-on supply chain impacts as well. But I think looking forward to the future, you know, the changes that we can really see, it's around innovation, and I think, you know, again, I keep coming back to this hook of the IGP, but, you know, that kind of disrupting the industry in terms of the O&M services is going to be critical in terms of, you know, really maximising the operations that we can get, the availability, you know, smart sort of maintenance and so on, making sure that we have sort of reduced shutdown times. So I think that's going to be critical. And again, a shameless plug, I'm afraid, but the OWGP has a live grant funding at the moment on innovation, and one of the sectors there is sort of the innovation of O&M services. So it's something the industry is really looking at, and I think as we move to maybe a more technically focused O&M service, that might get sort of the younger people hooked in a bit more than you know, the thinking of the kind of traditional aspects of going out on a boat and fixing a turbine with a spanner, which I think is a perception
quite a big spanner needed. Yes. Yeah. Andrew, from your point of view, is that an increasing share of your own business?
Well, there's a couple of interesting points. So to put some numbers to it, in supply chain plans that are going out of favour now in terms of sustainable investment rewards, the local content that you deliver from an offshore wind farm, you can get up to your 50-60%, not through what you're manufacturing and what you're installing. That will get you something like 20%. It is all about the O&M that gets you that. But what's interesting, of course, is that in the Giga Fund and in the SIR's offer that the government is kind of looking at, it deliberately parks O&M because A, that is something that they know is going to come to the UK, so it's almost like, well, that's a given, and B, because they can't monitor out to that duration of time. So that's kind of you know, understandably deliberately parked. But it is the absolute mainstay. So out of the 2,000 some employees in the country for us, around 1,000 are in building blades in Hull, and a good part of the rest are in servicing offshore wind farms or servicing wind farms in the UK. A couple of things, let's not forget we've got a thriving and a healthy onshore industry. The challenge with that is offshore is getting all of the sort of sexiness and attraction, and we, you know, onshore feels that they're training the guys to then go offshore to make the money and disappear. So we've got to manage the health of both. And that's got to be through, you know, I want to go home every night versus I want to kind of earn the money offshore, etc. But I do a little bit of STEM work in schools, and firstly, if you can overcome the titters of teenagers when you say you work for Siemens, once you get beyond that, you can then start kind of getting some STEM topics across. But what we have in this industry is a beautiful, tangible product that we can say, this is what we do. And I show the videos of, you know, women and men going offshore to maintain turbines. But of course, the message is, you're not all going to go and do that. What you are going to go and do is do law and become the lawyer. You're going to go and do, you know, something to do with organization. You'll become the project manager or the planner or the commercial manager, or you'll go and hang off a blade when you're young, and then when you're slightly older, you'll say, actually, I want a desk. So I think what we have is a brilliant sort of totem that we can say, come to this industry, and of course it has the panoply of everything else you can do there, but, you know what we are doing when we're going offshore is both exciting, as well as clean, as well as sustainable, as well as secure. So.
It's an exciting future. I think we're nearly out of time, but I've got one last question I'll sneak in here. 2030, it's not that far away, really. So if you were sitting here in 2030, with what we've achieved and where we're at, gosh, at least 2, maybe 3 general elections in between, who knows, and how many prime ministers, goodness only knows. But I don't know, your perspective, standing here in 2030, what can we celebrate? Joanne?
I've often asked myself this question actually on the Freeport, and said I wish I could get in a time machine and come back in 5 or 10 years and just see what we achieved, and also whether people were happy with what we achieved. But I think if I was to do that, and if I was to come back to the Commonwealth Earth, then I hope there would be factories all over manufacturing components, that we would be seeing components coming up that are made in other parts of the UK, that we would have the first floating wind projects coming through. So rather than the oil rigs we see at the moment, or alongside the oil rigs that we see at the moment in the Cromarty Firth, we would have floating substructures waiting to be integrated. Our development would be built and already integrating and pre-commissioning the turbines, and they would be being installed offshore. And I think, you know, if we've got an industry that is operating at a good capacity, and I think Melissa mentioned that drumbeat of projects. If we've managed to obtain that and secure as much local content as we can, then I would think we'd look back with pride and think we were there at the start. And my chief exec actually just retired after 11 years at the port. He has obviously worked a lot longer than that, but his background was in oil and gas, and he retired a couple of weeks ago. And he said to me a few months ago, you will remember this time, and I think it applies to all of us. He remembers the early days of oil and gas, and he remembers every single oil field and oil platform that he worked on, and he still knows the names, and he remembers all of that history, and he remembers being there at the start. And I think for all of us in offshore wind, we will probably have all of that throughout our lives as well, and may they be long and healthy, so that we can look back with pride and say we were there at the start and we helped make that happen.
So creating something good. Ben, from your perspective, 2030, what can you say you've seen?
So I'd like to be able to look back and say over the last 5 years, 5.5 years, we have seen at least 6 and no more than 9 gigawatts clearing in every allocation round, at prices that are sustainable. We have seen all those projects coming through the consenting, permitting process on a predictable timeline with predictable outcomes, with timely grid connections, and all of that has unlocked at least £500 million to £1 billion a year of investment in UK supply chain.
What more could one want?
That's not a big ask.
No, it's
Well, it's not actually.
No,
It's within our grasp,
easy.
but that would be a fantastic.
easy. Keep going. Yeah,
success.
that's a fair point of view.
Yeah, I think 2030 is always held up as this kind of pinnacle, and we're going to get there, and
I wanna live
everyone's
that
gonna
long.
look at
Keep
each
going.
other and wonder what happened. But I think maybe sort of taking a slightly different tack than the project focus. From my perspective, I think what I'd really like to see is some stability. A really good, well-functioning delivery body that wraps up a lot of these conversations we've been discussing on the panel. So, how is all the funding pooled, and how is it then being distributed to areas which create the most value for the industry, and really unlocking some of those issues around energy security, sort of critical path on the supply chain, which will then sort of ultimately bring forward a project. So, yeah, consistency and stability, I guess, are my sort of buzzwords for 2030.
Excellent. Matches well with Benji's, I hope. So, Andrew, to finish on.
So I think we'll be on CFD 12 then. Well, hopefully we'll be at about at least 40. I doubt we'll make 50, but let's call it 45 gigawatts of offshore wind installed. It's, I'm afraid, going to be mostly fixed, but let's back that we will have at least one, if not a couple of serial or floating offshore wind projects being prepared out of half a dozen ports dotted around the UK, 2 top, 2 left, 2 right. We'll have targets out to 2040, and we will be at least out to 2040 of annual pipeline, like Ben says, and we'll have that annual supply chain funding process just part of our DNA.
Excellent. So, exciting vision to play on, and I'm pleased to say we've reached the witching hour of 3:30, and I'd like to thank my panelists, all of them, for their willingness to take the questions and engage. It's been a really interesting journey this afternoon. So very much indeed, I'd like to thank Joanne Alday from Cromarty Firth, Melissa Reid from Equinor, Andrew Elms from Siemens, and Ben Sykes from Ørsted. So really interesting tour. Please give them a round of applause, and yourselves one too.